Poor people are poor people, and they don't understand. A man's got to make whatever he wants and take it with his own hands. Poor people.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Another Now, DMTV's little chat show where we explore ideas about post-capitalism. The post-capitalism that, according to some of us, and maybe I'm talking about myself here, is already here, a very dystopic, quite awful post-capitalism, which I call techno-feudalism. More on this later or in another program. But also visions of a post-capitalism worth having, worth living for, and worth maybe fighting for. Tonight, tomorrow tomorrow if you're in Australia, or this morning if you're in the Americas, my great privilege is to have as a guest a very significant person in my life. He doesn't know that, I don't think. Michael Albert is an economist, activist, journalist, publisher, communicator. Michael, the reason why I said what I said is because, as you know, I've been following you for years now, years and years and years. And I remember during difficult times of international conflict, in particular, let me give you an example, 1999 Yugoslavia. I used to live in Australia back then. Every day I would go to Z Communication, ZNet, ZMag in order to be informed about what was going on in the Balkans. So from Australia, I would have to visit the United States, your websites, in order to glean some aspects of the truth that was being hidden to us by the systemic media. But the reason why you're here, Michael, today is because of the work that you've done now for decades on what you call participatory economics, on an attempt to imagine a society, a social economy, a political economy, without bosses, without the division between profits and wages, without hierarchical institutions, without state authority, and without corporate power. Now, of course, all this sounds like a wonderful utopia. And I have no doubt that all your life you've been fending off the question, but how realistic is this? So, with no further ado, Michael Albert, welcome to DMTV's Another Now, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me and for that very nice introduction. Thank you, Yanis.
Michael, participatory economics, give us an overview of what you've been doing over the last few decades. Why and what?
Well, the why was that, as you say, many decades ago, when I was much younger, and we were very active in, a multitude of ways, we would very, very often run into the question, what do you want? What do you want beyond capitalism? Or what do you want beyond racism? Or whatever the person happened to be asking about. And at the time, it was often a question that was designed, or at least we felt it was designed to stifle us. That is, if we didn't have a full comprehensive answer that, could stand up to tremendous scrutiny, then we had no right to be demonstrating against the war or against racism or whatever. And so that initially made many of us sort of resistant to the question and sort of feeling like the question was unfair. But after a while, I and a friend, a close friend at the time, Robin Hanel, began to realize, wait a minute, this question really is fair. When people are asking us what we want, they're basically saying, you want me to take risks, you want me to change the way I approach life, you want me to desire something, and you're not telling me what the hell it is. And you're not answering my questions about what would take the place of capitalism. Capitalism is horrible, I know, but it delivers the goods and it keeps us alive, or at least most of us alive. And you're not assuaging my fear. Okay, so that got us going. And then for a long time, we've addressed the question, what do you want? In particular, beyond capitalism, Robin and I, but also beyond other facets of modern social organization. And regarding capitalism, we came up with something called participatory economics. So it's a vision for post-capitalism. It's not what has been sometimes called 20th century socialism. It's not that. It's new in certain respects. It has just a very few key defining features. It's not a blueprint. It's a kind of a scaffold on which, by future experience, we will fill it out with details. And, I can summarize if you want, but
Before you summarize, a question that I'm
Yeah.
sure crops up in people's mind.
sure.
What were your influences? Because, nobody starts tabula rasa, carte blanche. You must have had influences. For instance, the obvious one that comes to mind is, anarcho-syndicalism in the 1920s and 30s, or maybe the self-management model in Yugoslavia. Were those influences of yours?
Well, I went to MIT, and this all began when I was there. And some of your viewers may know that Chomsky was at MIT, and we were very close and good friends. And so he was a profound influence. Another influence that would probably come as a surprise to many was music, in particular Bob Dylan. His music meant a lot to me and had very profound impact upon me, I think. And then, as you say, anarchism per se, Bakunin, Kropotkin, and so on, and some lesser known strands, Council Communism, Anton Pannekow, Rudolf Rocker. These were all things that, we became familiar with. But it was easily as much practice, the practical pressure of having to answer that question, what do you want? And then the experience of trying to think through an alternative. What would be the basic things that we would have to get rid of? For us, it was really, to put it in anarchist terms, I suppose, we wanted to have a future that was self-managing, that where people were controlling their own lives. And so the question became for us, regarding the economy, what are the features that are essential so that future workers and consumers can indeed control their own lives, can indeed fill out the details of how they're going to live? What has to be there for them to be in a position to do that? What are the essential features of what we call participatory economy?
Well, before we get to the nitty-gritty of it, you must realize that it is impossible for me not to ask the pertinent question, which is, what is the precise link between Bob Dylan and your perspective? Give our viewers an example of one lyric, one song, one piece of music that changed your perspective on how we get things done in this society of ours.
I can't sing, but if readers listen to, say, Maggie's Farm, or listen to Subterranean Homesick Blues, or listen to there are elements of, I don't want to say Dylan informed the literal structure of participatory economics, no, but he did move the spirit of it, I guess I would say. He did help me become radical to such an extent that I would pursue something like that. Get born, keep warm, romance, learn to dance, get dressed, get blessed, try to be a success, please her, please him, don't steal, don't lift, and so on. If you listen closely, it was very powerful. For my generation, it was very powerful. It's hard to talk about.
Well, you're preaching to the converted, in the sense that I've always believed that music in particular is a major motivator of social design, of revolutionary thinking. But let's go beyond that. Okay, so an alternative to capitalism, you start trying to answer this question. Whatever your influences might have been, what was the first theoretical and practical problem you tackled? What was it? How does the market work?
No, first, remember, we're talking very young, moving to the left. So first was property. First was the thing that I think is simplest to think about in many respects, which was basically, should a few people own all these assets, let's call them factories, workplaces, resources, by which we feed, clothe, and share in good things in life? Should they own those things, have dominion over them, that is, control them, and also accrue all this great wealth from them? And it didn't take long at all to decide, no. If you have that, then future people will not be in a position to self-manage. So if you want self-management, you simply have to do away with it. Not do away with the fact that you own the shirt you're wearing, but do away with the fact that you or anyone else owns Amazon and Microsoft and Google and General Motors and all the various. That has to be eliminated. And once you're going to eliminate that ownership, you're left with the problem. Well, if the owner doesn't have dominion, who does? Answer: self-management means that workers and consumers do. And so if we look at workplaces, workers do. How? Where? Workers' councils. That's a time-honored notion. There was nothing particularly new about that, obviously, but we immediately gravitated to the idea of workers' councils and workers' self-management. And that maybe there is a little bit of an innovation there. So instead of thinking in terms of only one person, one vote, we, coming out of the 60s and the New Left, knew that, wait a minute, there are lots of circumstances in which that actually doesn't make much sense. If you're in a workplace, there are decisions that affect some people and not others. So not everybody should have one person, one vote majority rule. There are decisions which by virtue of affecting some people more, those people should have more say in, and thus emerged our notion of self-management, which is that people should have a say in decisions to the degree that they're affected by them, at least, as much as you can within reason. It's not, social things are not done to the third decimal point, but basically people should have a say in decisions to the degree that are affected by them. So we have self-managing councils as the first step, I suppose, the first feature of participatory economics is that produced assets, natural assets, so resources and workplaces, produced and natural, also accumulated knowledge. These things are all part of a commons, a productive commons. And then the workplaces, the dominion over the workplaces, with attention to the self-management of people outside the workplaces as well, is workers' self-managing councils and consumer self-managing councils in neighborhoods. So those were the first steps, I think.
Beginning with property, of course, from what you say, and I understand that because this is my background as well, the first thing you do is you adopt the traditional left-wing approach to property, that means of production should be socialized, should be owned, means of production, distribution, and exchange, to be more precisely, should not be owned privately, but they should be socialized, and some kind of social management that goes beyond the market, that effectively moves away from the market.
Well, we haven't gotten there yet in your questioning, but yes, of course.
Yeah. But of course, that puts you in the same camp as a very broad church, from standard communism to, as I said before, I mentioned Yugoslav self-managed communism, even the Labour Party in Britain. You really remember that famously Tony Blair tried to put his mark on the Labour Party by eliminating Clause 4 of the Constitution, which was precisely that, a commitment, which was, of course, just symbolic by the 1990s, of the Labour Party to socialize all means of production, distribution, and exchange. So we are moving towards the differentiation of your thinking from the rest of the left by concentrating on the concept of worker council. Now, can you explain worker council? How does it differ from a self-managed firm?
Depends what you mean by a self-managed firm. But a workers' council is basically, if you're going to have workers in the workplace have a say, much less have a say in proportion to the degree they're affected, there needs to be a venue. We call the venue the workers' council. There's nothing complicated about this.
But what makes it No, the practical question I'm asking to understand, a worker council comprises workers from one company, from one sector, from many
Well,
sectors, many different kinds of companies.
there's workers' councils inside each workplace. There's federations of worker councils inside an industry, and then there's the entire economy. There's also consumer councils because some consumption is collective. So you consume as an individual, but also you consume as a member of a neighborhood or a community. So there's consumers councils also. The next step in the development of the model was something like this. The minute that we started talking about self-management and that we started talking about people having a say in decisions, then arises the question, well, are people prepared or able to have a say in decisions? You don't want people to be making decisions lacking something that's essential to making the decision. And what's essential to making decisions, we decided, was that people had a degree of confidence, a degree of inclination to do it, a degree of information commensurate to it. So we began looking at why that isn't the case. So in other words, in typical capitalist firms, but also in 20th century socialist firms, there seems to be a problem, which is, at least for us, wanting self-management. And the problem that we saw was that about 20% of the workforce was very much capable, in position to make decisions. Their situations empowered them sufficiently so that they could participate sensibly in decisions. But it seemed to us, and I think it's the case, that 80% of the workforce was not. That 80% of the workforce did tasks each day as their work, comprising their job, that were disempowering, that were rote, that were repetitive, that separated workers from one another, that did not provide information, that deadened and exhausted instead of enlivening. And so we began to notice that, wait a second, it isn't the case that there's just capitalists and just workers, and that all we have to do is get rid of the fact that these capitalists own everything. Just eliminate that, and we're done somehow. We have solved the class difference cause of injustice. And we began to realize that wasn't the case, that there was another class, and we called it the coordinator class. And you were talking about the differences between what we were coming up with and what had existed. And this is, I think, a very major difference. The difference being that for us, there was owners and workers at first when we thought about it, but then when we thought about it more, we decided there were owners, coordinator class between workers and workers and owners, and workers, and that if we wanted classlessness, which we obviously did, if we wanted self-management, if we wanted classlessness, we had to not only get rid of the monopoly ownership of property, productive property, but we had to get rid of whatever it was that caused the 20% to be above the 80%. So if what caused the 20% to be above the 80% was the 20% were smarter, were genetically endowed or something, like being taller, well, we would be up against a big problem. But we decided that was nonsense, that what in fact separated the 20% from the 80% was the training and the background and the on-the-job circumstances of the 20%. The fact that their relation to the means of production, to put it in terms that other people use, was different. The coordinator class's relation to the means of production was such as to empower them, give them confidence, etc. And the working class's relations to the means of production was such as to disempower them. And so not surprisingly, the 20% would dominate the 80%. So if we wanted self-management, we had to get rid of that. How do you do it? Well, it's not complicated. It's not rocket science. If the reason why 20% dominates 80% is because 20% monopolizes empowering circumstances and tasks, and 80% is left with disempowering circumstances and tasks, what you have to do is disperse that. You have to have what we call balanced job complexes, which was redefining work in such a way that people's jobs were a combination of tasks and responsibilities, such that the combination comparably empowered people. It does mean, for example, that you don't spend all your time doing conceptual and organizational and commanding work, and somebody else spends all their time doing rote and obedient work. It means instead that we all do a mix. Doesn't mean we all do surgery or we all do anything. There's still a division of labor. It's just that we've portioned out the tasks and responsibilities in a manner which doesn't deny 80%. And while we're at it, we've then immediately changed something about the rest of society. Instead of, for instance, the educational system existing to literally prepare 80% to take orders and endure boredom, and prepare 20% to command around the 80%, we now have, if we make this change, a school system, a educational apparatus, which is designed to bring everybody into an economy and a society in which they are full partners, full participants, full decision makers, etc. So basically, the educational system, instead of stamping out the creativity and the qualities of 80%, fulfills or addresses and tries to develop the capacities and abilities of everyone. So that was the second thing. So we had a commons of productive assets, workers and consumers self-managing councils, and then the next step was balanced job complexes. It's not a whole model yet, but we're getting someplace, we thought.
Before we continue, perhaps a little break, because you mentioned the difficulty that Condorcet famously highlighted, that power structures and authority is to be found, the cause of it, the secret of power, is to be found in the minds of the powerless, not in the minds of the powerful. So the pattern of discrimination is usually reproduced by the behaviors of those who are being discriminated against, who learn to accept the discrimination. And, you know, I was reminded because, Michael, this is a television program we try to make it as. Today is the 80th anniversary here in Greece of a momentous event. Two young men in their teens, 19-year-olds, two friends, climbed up on the on the Acropolis hill, and in the middle of the night brought down the swastika. It was during the first year of the Nazi occupation, and that was the first act of resistance in the whole of Europe. The reason why I'm mentioning it is because one of them, Manolis Glezos, who only died last year, he lived a very long and fruitful life. He was telling us once that he was a communist initially, and then he became very powerfully engaged in the notion of self-management. So he would tour Greece and preach the benefits of thinking in terms of self-management. I think you would have really liked Manolis. And he told me once that he was giving this speech that, you know, that the first thing we need to do is to liberate ourselves from the yoke of the fear or the belief that we need somebody to liberate us, that we have to liberate ourselves. And everybody clapped and everybody was extremely happy, and they asked him to lead and liberate them. So, how do you overcome that? That's a really practical issue, isn't it?
Yes. We're moving from vision to strategy, I suppose.
Just briefly, so that we don't go from, you know, one part of the model to another.
I'll give you another example of it. I was in Venezuela talking to a fellow who was trying to organize in a workplace, and this was back. Chavez was in power, and they were trying to produce or to generate a degree of workers' management, and the workers were resisting. There was no owner there to resist. This guy was basically the authority until workers would become the authority, except the workers didn't want to become the authority, which is an example of what you're saying. Yeah. You know, he's very frustrated by it, incredibly frustrated by it. I think it's understandable. The workers didn't trust it. The workers felt, well, wait a minute, this is all just a bunch of rhetoric, and what he's really trying to do is get us to produce more by making believe that he cares about us and that he cares about our controlling our own lives. And so they felt they were being tricked. That's a little different from what you were describing, but it's another aspect of the same problem. Um, it points to the fact that movements and organizations should recognize that it's a problem and therefore not ask the impossible immediately, right? Shouldn't just say, well, everybody has to play a full and equal role to everybody else starting tomorrow and all will be well, and then people go home. You have to operate in context of what exists, trying to achieve that which you want for the future. And so in the context of what exists includes people sometimes being not aware of possibilities, sometimes being aware of, afraid of possibilities. I'm no Maoist, but Mao had this slogan, dare to struggle, dare to win. And when I was all of 20 or 25, I started to think about that slogan, and I thought to myself, wait a second, I get dare to struggle. Of course, you have to dare to struggle. There's possible losses. You know, you could get hurt. You could go to jail. You have to dare to. What's this dare to win stuff? Why do you have to dare to win? And I thought at the time, and I still think there was a considerable bit of wisdom in that people are afraid of the responsibility that comes with that comes with making decisions about what's going to be. So all of these things are serious problems, and I do think they point to the need for a movement which is sensitive to the problems, but which does empower people steadily. So you don't set up, say, movement organizations with a corporate division of labor, which speaks to the background of people, and they know how to relate to it. But in relating to it, they are continuing to reproduce their own subordination. So instead, what you have to do is set up organizations which empower people and which require responsibility and so on. But then again, you don't do it so fast and so aggressively that it's impossible. It takes time. And that's just a hard line to walk. And I'm sure it happens in a larger scale. Now I'll go out on a limb. It happens if you're in the government in a country like, say, Greece, and you want a degree of participation and democracy and even self-management, and people aren't rushing to do it yet. They're rushing to demonstrate. They're rushing to get angry at injustice, but they're not rushing to take over their own lives fully and to take responsibility. And then you're left making decisions. And you don't want to because you think it's excluding others from doing it, but you do want to because if you don't do it, it will be worse. Okay, these are the kinds of problems that are more subtle than what leftists mostly talk about, but are, very important to who people become and how they interact. Anyway,
a couple of questions to connect it with the next point you want to make. You mentioned that your own predilection towards the idea that votes must be proportional to responsibilities, and you should only have a vote on matters that affect you. Now, one worry with this idea, which is logical, but nevertheless brings up this concern, is that, as we know, the greatest threat to any kind of flat management, social organization, participatory scheme is that the worst of humanity prevails by creating surreptitiously power structures that are informal power structures, and which use the best intentions of those who wrote the rules for the worst possible outcome. So, for instance, who decides what? Let's say I'm part of this workers' council. I'm part of this organization of yours. Who decides the limits of what affects me? If, for instance, because if somebody has to decide how many votes I get, and therefore somebody needs to decide what affects me, what's my business and what's not my business. Isn't that person going to have inordinate power over me?
Yeah, if you set it up that way, they would. I agree. But I don't think that that you have to do that. I mean, what we're saying is something like this. People should have a say in decisions in proportion to the degree they're affected. Well, how does that happen? So in a workplace, you have a work team of 10 people, I don't know, and you have a workplace of 100 or 2,000 people. Some decisions affect everybody.
Okay, but who decides that? Because I may say that everything, what these people are doing on the 6th floor affects me.
Yeah,
Even
but
if it's not particularly logical that it should.
well,
But who
aside
tells me to get off?
aside from the fact that everybody around you would tell you to get off, set that aside for a minute because it's true, I think. But set that aside for a minute. If we're going to do this, the answer to the question who decides is always the workers' council. It's not some enshrined leader someplace. Most decisions, or many decisions, are going to be one person, one vote, majority rules. Why? Because they affect everybody comparably. There are some decisions that wouldn't be true for. So, for example, if you're hiring somebody new in a work team, the people in the work team are far more affected by that new hire who they have to spend every day with, right, than people who aren't in the work team. So by and large, a decision like that would be made by those 10, but it has to be in context of the fact that, well, the work in the workplace has to get done. So the person had to be hired has to be competent, has to be able to do the job. But the personality fit would be with the 10 people. I think in practice, it turns out to be not so easy, not so difficult. I mean, I've done it and it wasn't so difficult. But in any case, I don't think it turns out to be so difficult. There are decisions.
No, I agree with you. I agree with you.
There are decisions.
In our movement, in DiEM25, everybody has a vote about everything. But we have a convention, a social convention amongst ourselves, that you only vote about things that you know something about and they affect you.
Okay, so that's comparable.
But it's not to say that you are tying that there's any kind of formal or informal system whereby you are linking the number of votes people have with particular responsibilities. You simply you just based on trust.
It's
don't
not
vote
that
on things that don't concern you.
It's not that people get more or less votes. It's not that you get more votes or less votes. It's something more like this. Voting involves, or arriving at a decision involves two crucial things: deliberation, right? Talking about it, working it through, et cetera, and then voting, making the decision. So making the decision is 9 times out of 10, I think, or way more than that, a function of voting and tallying votes according to some algorithm. So the way I see it is more like, well, sometimes 3/4 is needed. Sometimes consensus is needed. Sometimes it's one person, one vote majority rule. And sometimes the whole body has to vote, and because the whole body is involved in deliberating and determine. And sometimes in light of other decisions, like the length of the workday, say, or all sorts of decisions, a team is deciding. I don't think it's that Joe gets 6 votes and Sue gets 5 votes and Yanis gets 1 vote. It's more the way you have more say or more impact is by virtue of the fact that the constituency has more. So in other words, 3/4 are needed, or 2/3 are needed, or whatever it may be. We used to have votes at South End Press where, for some things, for instance, for selecting a book, we had some complicated rules. Why? Because everybody was affected by a book that was selected. Even if you weren't working on it, it reflected on the character of the institution. So it affected everybody. But it was also true that if it was in your area, it probably affected you more, and et cetera, et cetera. And so we would have decisions about how many were needed to block a decision. So in other words, we might say one person, one vote majority rule, but 2 people can stop it, thereby giving any 2, So I don't think we should work through all the details. I think it's possible to come up with approaches to decision making and then to utilize them in such a way as to do a good job of delivering self-managing influence to people. The place where it's hard is a place that I guess we'll get to in a while, which is different, which is if a workplace is producing bicycles, right, it obviously affects the people who are doing the producing of the bicycles, but it also affects the people who want to ride bicycles, and it also affects people who would breathe the air around the bicycle factory if it was releasing pollutants. And it even produces everybody in the economy because it uses steel and it uses rubber that could have been used for something else.
Okay, so let's go straight to this question. How does this decision get made in your work?
So far we're skipping remuneration. Okay.
We will come to remuneration. I'm an economist. I cannot skip remuneration. But let's.
Well, that would be next the way we developed it. But if you want to skip to allocation,
let's skip it and come back to remuneration because you mentioned the bicycle production. Okay. It affects consumers. It affects the environment. It affects the neighbors. And it affects the people who make the bicycles, the people who make the tires, and so on. So
and it affects everybody because it uses stuff. And it affects everybody because it uses stuff.
Yeah,
right.
Of course.
Right. Okay. So. The economists will tell us, maybe not you, but most economists will tell us that our only option is central planning or markets or some combination, some amalgamation of central planning and markets. And when Robin and I were thinking about this, this made us sort of nauseous because to our minds, it's one form of poison and another form of poison. Central planning obviously violates, its very definition violates self-management, but it also creates that same class division that we were focused on, that we saw as a threat to post-capitalist economy, a threat to introduce a new boss, out with the old boss, in with the new boss, out with the owner, in with the coordinator class controller of the economy. So we didn't want that, and central planning generates that.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I didn't get that.
In other words,
I'm not disputing what you're saying. I just want to understand it a bit better. So why would involving a marketplace for part of the
let me finish the central planning. That comes next.
Why would it involve a coordinator class? The whole point about markets is that you don't have a coordinator.
Okay, so we're agreed on central planning, that we just dispense with that.
Yes, of course.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's gone, and now we're over to markets. And so markets have, I think, lots of problems, and I want to get to the one that you mentioned because that's the most subtle one, but quickly cover some of the others. I think markets produce in humans the most sort of individualist, in the worst sense, kind of mindset, right? You enter the market and it's you fleece your exchange partner, right? Each partner in the exchange tries to do as well as they can, oblivious to the effects upon others, and so that's an impact upon the development of people's personalities that's adverse. Okay. Markets don't take into account pollution.
But it's not that you're introducing.
But what about your listeners? What about your listener? All right, I'll skip it. All right, so markets.
Go on.
Right,
go on. I was just saying that this is a very important criticism of markets.
Okay.
That they dehumanize people and that they replace real values with exchange values, right? But it's not the same thing as saying that there's a coordinator in the market.
Exactly, it's not. So then the next thing would be, or among the next things, there really are a lot of failings of markets, I think. But another big one, which would be enough to cause somebody to say, not for me, would be that markets don't take into account external effects. So the buyer and the seller exert their wills in the exchange, but the people who are affected at a distance don't. So pollution is not properly accounted, and so on and so forth. That's why the people who don't like markets and argue for central planning will argue for that and will say central planning can do better. In any case, all right, let's get to the more subtle question, which is, well, what do markets have to do with class division? It doesn't. There's just buyers and sellers. What's the big deal? How do markets generate a class division? Well, markets require competition. That's what a market is. A market is a competitive approach to allocation. And firms compete. And so let's say we have a bicycle firm and there's 1,000 bicycle firms. The reality is that in a market system, even if you don't have owners, even if you distribute the surplus from the market's operations among the workforce, it's still the case that the market is competing for market share with other firms. Otherwise, the markets just don't mean anything. I mean, that's intrinsic to what a market is. Okay, so let's say that we have a workforce, and we initially go all the way with participatory aims. So we take over a workplace, we institute our workers' council, and we institute even self-management within it. And we also make remuneration equitable. We haven't talked about that yet, but let's say we do it.
Yeah.
And now what? We even institute balanced job complexes. So we even do that. Now that's the thing that's often missing, but we even do that. Then what happens due to the market? Well, the market is going to cause our workplace to have to compete with other workplaces. And what that means is we have to try and reduce our costs, increase our output, and do both regardless. Regardless of what? Well, regardless of, to a considerable extent, effects on others and on us, as long as we're increasing the product and we're decreasing the costs. So as a workforce in a workers' council, we have to decide for speed up. We have to decide not to have the daycare that we wanted to institute. We have to decide to dump our waste on the local neighborhood. Why do we have to decide those things? Well, because other firms can decide those things. And if other firms start to decide those things and we don't, they'll outcompete us. And pretty soon we'll have a nice, equitable, morally exemplary workplace and no market share. And so we'll all be screwed. So how do we do that? Well, one way we could do that, now I admit there's a certain degree of prediction in this, I suppose. One way we could do that is we could all sit around and talk about how best to screw ourselves, because that's what it is, right? Ultimately, it's making decisions to generate the surplus, to get market share, despite the fact that they're painful for us and even painful for our neighbors, and arguably even painful for consumers. For instance, all right, let's leave that out for a minute. Or we could try and find people who are well suited to make those kinds of decisions. And where would we look for them? Business schools. So we could go to, Cambridge or Oxford and look for people who have been trained to not feel pain when they cause pain to others, to rationalize it, who have been trained in the art of screwing us, right? And we bring them into our workplace, and then we notice another problem. If we give them the same circumstances that we all have, they'll be in the same situation that we were in. They'll be bad at screwing us and themselves. So we'll put them in an air-conditioned office, and we'll give them a different schedule, and we'll give them different perks, and we'll give them power over these decisions, and then we'll say, screw us. And pretty soon we have a coordinator class. And
that sounds very much like universities that I've known.
But yeah, it's not an unusual phenomenon. But the place where you can see it in an economy and in a real life economy is partly in Yugoslavia, because that did happen, and partly in within capitalist countries, in firms that are operating on a market, but nonprofit and taken over, and so it's just a surplus. It's not going to private ownership, et cetera. You see these same kinds of things. You don't see it too much because, in fact, a prior step does the job instead. That is the corporate division of labor. So when in say Argentina, workers took over lots and lots of firms and began operating them, because the capitalists left and what I call the coordinator class left, and the workers were left with the firms, and they took them over, and a very influential experience for me was giving a talk to a group of about, I don't know, 50, 75 such workers gathered together for the purpose of discussing the circumstances from all over the place. And at the beginning, they were very lively and energetic and engaged with one another. And then, I said, let's go around the room a little bit and report on what's happening, and then I'll talk, because I was invited to speak. And they started off, and by the time we got to the seventh person, and I literally remember this, the room was no longer animated. It was maudlin. It was depressed. And the reason was that person after person was recounting how their effort, initially tremendously energetic and exciting, was devolving. They were functioning. They take over the workplaces, and they had them functioning successfully. But they also said, and the way they put it was, all the old crap is coming back. We made our incomes essentially equal, not quite what I would argue for, but that's what they did. We instituted a council and democracy, and so on and so forth. But now it's all going back to the way it was. And I asked them, do you think that's because of human nature? Do you think it's because of the complexity of the technical requisites of production? They all did think it was one or both. And then I talked, and I said, look, I don't even think it's either. I think it's something very different. I think it's, and I have to ask you a question. When you took over the workplace, did you change the nature of the jobs, or did you have somebody do the job of the manager, do the job of the financial officer, do the job, et cetera, et cetera? And they said, what are you talking about? Of course we did. For them, it was like asking, did they have lunch breaks, right? In other words, it had never crossed anybody's mind to not have the jobs that existed. And so what happened is people filled those jobs. They were working class people with a working class background who had taken over the place, who were gung-ho, and who slowly but surely were becoming coordinator class in their attitudes to other workers and thinking of themselves as superior and more deserving and so on. And so all the old crap was coming back. So
it's a little bit like liberal feminists who think that gender equality means to have CIA torturers that are also women. So,
okay, it's and so that was a profound problem, and the market didn't need to do it because the retaining of the corporate division of labor had already done it.
No, that's a brilliant point.
But I think the markets would have done it had it not been, had they changed the division of labor. And I'll tell you, in the South End Press, a publishing house that we formed, the pressure of the market on the operation, even with us, making all the changes, was enormous. And it's hard to buck against it. So if you're not going to have, okay, go ahead.
No, I was saying that there's so much to talk about, especially this example of where you have a cooperative firm competing against multinational publishing houses. But because the point of this encounter, Michael, like all DMTV encounters, is to whet the appetite of the audience so that they go on and read your stuff. Because there's so much to be talked about. And we are soon coming to the last 10, 12 minutes. So I want to give you an opportunity to address the basic questions that we have not addressed: remuneration. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Secondly, innovation. How does innovation happen in your system? And thirdly, I think that it would be hugely remiss of us not to answer this question or pose the question: what's the role of money in your economy? So remuneration, innovation, money. Go.
In 12 minutes. Okay, so remuneration, the idea that we came up with for remuneration, or the notion that we came up with for remuneration, it obviously shouldn't be for property. We got rid of that. It shouldn't be bargaining power. It shouldn't be a thug's economy, which is basically what we live in. Markets are basically bargaining power, so it shouldn't be that. But it also shouldn't be output. It shouldn't be, we believed, that people would get more income by virtue of the fact that they were born with certain talents and certain inborn genetic endowment. We didn't see any reason why, and in fact, it seemed to us morally sort of vapid to reward people on top of their luck in the genetic lottery, or to reward people on top of their luck in having better equipment, or to reward people on top of their luck of happening to work with people who were, let's say, more conducive to productivity or something. So what we decided was, I mean, it's a much longer discussion, but what we decided was that remuneration should be for how long you work, for how hard you work, and for the onerousness of the conditions under which you work. And that's it. And it turns everything upside down now, for the obvious reason that in a market economy, remuneration is very much a function of bargaining power. But if you have bargaining power, then you also will have the ability to work shorter and to work under better conditions and to do less onerous things. So you get the opposite of what we think is just, right? Instead of, and it turns out, it's again a discussion, but it turns out that this is incentive smart. These are the things for which incentive, that is, income, right, as an incentive makes sense because it's what you can control. I can't pay you to become Mozart, right? To be endowed genetically differently. Can't do it. It's not there. And it also turns out that you actually need incentive to do things that are more distasteful, or that, are more demanding. That requires that there be the remuneration, or at least it benefits from there being the remuneration. Okay, so remuneration, we called it equitable remuneration. There's obviously much more to say. How do you arrive at it? Why exactly the incentives work, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so remuneration. The second one was innovation. And the third, what was the third one? Because I might change the order.
The third one was money. Money.
Oh. All right.
Well,
we didn't do too much about allocation. Participatory economics has participatory planning. Instead of markets and central planning, it has a process by which workers and consumers councils propose their activities, receive back information regarding the response to those proposals, as in, do people want the bicycles that you're proposing to produce? Do people want to produce the bicycles that you're proposing to consume? And so on. And that give and take, that process, which requires much more discussion, I think, to become compelling as something viable, but nonetheless, we think it is viable once discussed, arrives at a plan. And then during the course of the year, changes take place, updating the plan, and you get your final results. And this process, I think, it does not produce a class division and is consistent with self-management, which is why we favor participatory planning. Now, money. Well, money, it's prices. What we're talking about here is prices and income. Society produces a giant pie. People get a share of the pie by virtue of having an income. If you have more income, you can have a bigger share. If you have less, you can have a smaller share. What governs income is duration, intensity, and onerousness of socially valued labor. It has to be socially valued labor. That's important. We're not going to get into why, but that's crucial.
What monetary form does that take? I mean, do you have a central bank?
There's almost no money in our economy. The actual, it's basically.
I'm not talking about physical money. I'm talking about dollars. Do we have dollars in your economy?
Yeah. I mean, if that's what you use,
we have
dollars.
You have the Federal Reserve. Do you have commercial banks?
No, all of that's gone. What you have is that the planning process arrives at income for firms, the payroll for the firm, which is commensurate to duration, intensity, and onerousness for the totality of the workforce there. The workers there apportion the payroll because some people might be slacking off and some people might have wanted to work overtime, etc. So the workers apportion the payroll. You have an income. Think of it as a number on a digital thing. Doesn't matter.
Sure.
There are prices to stuff, right? And you spend your income on stuff, which you want. Can you borrow? Yes, that would be a somewhat of a discussion. It doesn't introduce any significant problems in this kind of an economy. So let's go back to your second one, which was innovation.
Yep.
Well, innovation, there's a number of kinds. So one kind would be, we're in a bicycle factory. How do innovations in bicycles come about? Another kind might be, we don't have a cure for something yet. How does a vaccine come about? Or how does new knowledge come about, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In essence, I think this isn't that different than how does other stuff get produced. That is to say, to some extent, what we're talking about is workplaces whose purpose is innovation, whose purpose is research and development. Nowadays, it's usually, I guess, parts of universities, but it's also divisions of big industries, right? And it seems to me that it's largely similar. The insight for an innovation in a bicycle factory is likely to come from bicycle workers. It might come from elsewhere.
Let me interrupt you here, because here I seem to be developing a serious objection.
I can tell.
When it comes to things people know that they want, your scheme makes perfect sense.
Okay.
But what about things that people don't know that they want?
You're talking the consumer or the producer?
No, the consumer.
Oh, okay.
Or even the producer. I mean,
Okay.
I remember I was talking to, back in the 1980s, I was talking to one of the mathematicians at Cambridge University in England, who was one of the basic inventors of the cryptography, which is now running
Right.
the whole world.
Right.
The banking system, the internet, pay systems, and so on. And the guy was, he spent 40 years doing numerical analysis because it was useless, he thought.
Because what?
So-
Sorry?
Because it was useless. He thought that it was just
All right.
playing with numbers and that it was just aesthetically pleasing. And it
I've
was like
encountered
chess.
that
He said
too.
to me that I thought it was like chess, something that you do for pleasure.
Right. Right.
It's extremely stimulating intellectually, but
Right.
it has zero utility.
Right.
And then suddenly, without that, Google would not be the $1 trillion
Yeah.
that it is. So, if to get resources from society in order to pursue something that it is resource intensive, like research, like mathematics, like
Right.
whatever, and you need to do this through negotiating with consumers. Okay, if the consumers don't know what the value of what you're doing is, and if you yourself do not even know what the value that you may create might be,
Yeah, I
how
get it.
can you possibly say that the resources will be provided to people like this gentleman,
Right.
significant resources to do things that no one knows what the value is?
Because everyone knows and is perfectly capable of knowing. Remember, we're talking about a new kind of economy, a new kind of society where people are balanced jobs and educated and so on. Everybody is capable of understanding what I think is a relatively simple point, which is if you don't have innovation, if you don't have research in math or in physics or in biology or in whatever, including in engineering and in the mechanisms that we use to produce things and so on and so forth, then nothing changes and nothing improves. So it behooves us to allot a certain amount of productive assets to those things and for people to work in those areas. And so, if it can happen in our system, it can certainly happen in a system where, I mean, what I think you're driving at some level is something that artists also get nervous about because or musicians say, because they get nervous because they say to themselves, well, do I really have to convince the public that my art is worth doing? And the answer is not exactly. You have to convince the Workers' Council of Artists, right? Because you're being part of that council. They have you as part of that council because they appreciate the quality of your efforts, et cetera, et cetera. The council has to convince the public, in essence, right, that a certain amount of resources and energies and mental effort should be put to music. You don't have to this kind, this kind, this
Because you
kind.
realize that Bob Dylan would never make it.
He certainly, well, it's possible he wouldn't have, in the sense, if Bob Dylan got on American
the
Got
workers'
Talent now,
of musicians would have thrown him in a pit.
no, I don't agree. I think on day one, you're right? But on day one, that's exactly what happened, right? It wasn't any different than that. And Bob Dylan certainly couldn't have convinced Columbia Records to do anything on day one, or et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But what he could do, which he did, right, was to go to Greenwich Village and interact with other musicians and become part of a community of musicians, which then generated some materials which were, which were of interest. It would be actually far easier.
Woody Guthrie, yeah.
Sorry, what?
And get to know much about Woody Guthrie and be influenced by him. Michael, do we have you? What happened? Hello?
But we are. Oh, would you rather try to convince a banker to finance you, right? Or would you rather try to convince other artists, all of whom are not in threat for income? They're just concerned with their profession providing something of social worth. Would you rather convince them that you're worthy of being a musician?
Most youngers today would say that they really don't care either about bankers or about other musicians. They would use the internet to convince members of the public, youngsters like themselves, through YouTube, through Spotify, through various other channels, which of course is the marketplace. So that poses problems, right? But at the same time, it would be highly illiberal to say to them, no.
No, I don't think it does.
Your fellow artists.
I don't think it does. I mean, if you want to put stuff out free in a participatory economy, you can. There's no reason why not. And in fact, let's say you're a musician, you go to the Musicians Council. You're so fucking avant-garde, you're so ahead of your time that they look at you and think, come on, he's a crank. So they don't want to hire you as a musician. So instead, you're doing something else, right? And you create some music and you put it out there, and in fact, people like it. And you go back to the Musicians Council, and now you're a musician. That's fine.
Yeah, but what if they still don't like you? But there are people out there who are prepared to give you a penny each to keep going. Will your society, will your society ban this transaction?
I'm not sure. Right, it depends exactly what it is, but it does look to me like if it's transacting, it's probably a black market in essence. It's a black market.
But that's why I'm saying.
And then yes, would it or would it not ban it? Well, it depends. It would ban it if it was dangerous, if it was going to do harm, and it wouldn't if it wasn't.
Who judges that?
The population and the political system. No, the political system, democracy.
Oh, you want the society to decide whether a musician can play
I want society
distribute music, and whether people can, youngsters can give them a penny or $1 each.
I want
all folks to decide that.
Hold on, I want the political system to decide whether or not black markets, let's call it, are illegal and should be blocked. Now, I doubt that will be necessary. I can't imagine it would be necessary. But if they did decide that, then just like deciding that, murder should be blocked and stealing the shirt off somebody's back should be blocked, then that would be blocked. And it's not for me to decide today what a future society would decide about those things. But what I think we can say is that participatory planning instead of markets and central planning is consistent with self-management and classlessness and equitable remuneration and so on, that markets are not, that central planning is not, that corporate divisions of labor are not, and so on. And so we have a set of defining core institutions for a new society, for a new economy. The process of getting from where we are to the new economy will teach us a lot, right? That will teach us a tremendous amount.
This is the next and the final question because we've run out of time. Right. How does your world come about?
I think
Is
it
a
comes.
revolution what we need? Because clearly, the powers that be will fight tooth and nail. They will murder us
Right.
if we try to put together a society like we are. And
Well,
isn't there a danger that, like every revolution, that to create the power to defeat the forces of capital,
we'll compromise
we
us.
will then have difficulty giving it up
Yeah.
and moving towards participation?
I think both issues are perfectly reasonable, fair issues. I agree with you. It is the case that the people who hold power and who hold wealth don't want to lose it. And so they're not going to just say, oh, good, that's fine. And the people who are making the change, if the people who are making the change are organized in such a way that a small subset of them has extreme power and influence, whether by abdication of the others or by stealing it, that's a problem. I agree with you. So nobody says it's easy, but I think the way that it happens is something like a slow and steady increase in the numbers of people who favor a particular approach, a particular change, in this case, participatory economics, an effort by those people to, on the one hand, form new institutions and begin to structure them and to begin to change them and to begin to operate them. On the other hand, to sort of wage a battle, I suppose you could say. A European, Rudi Dutschke, said a long march through the institutions. In other words, at the same time as you're creating new ones, you're also battling within existing ones to introduce a degree of participation, a degree of openness, a degree of greater equitable remuneration, et cetera, et cetera. And over time, you're developing a movement that's strong enough. Now, is it a revolution ultimately? Yeah, of course it is. A revolution is not violence or nonviolence, right? A revolution is not fast or slow. A revolution is changing fundamental defining institutions.
Sure.
And that's what we're doing. So it is a revolution. Might it go faster or slower depending on certain variables? Yes. Might it involve more or less violence? Yes. To me, the way to reduce violence is to make it counterproductive for the people who are perpetrating it. So the only way you get the state to decide against more violent repression is if more violent repression is actually going to strengthen you instead of them. And so that you have to build movements so that that's the effect. Otherwise, you're right. If you become a threat and if they can repress you and get away with it, then they'll repress you and get away with it. So that's what you need to do. Even back in 1969, if I had been in Texas doing what I was doing in Massachusetts, we wouldn't be talking today because I would have been in jail, the whole time. But in Massachusetts, we had enough backing that we could just, I could stand up and tear up injunctions not to do X, not to go in such and such a place at such and such a time. And I would go to the place at the time with many other people and simply rip up the injunction. If I did that in Texas, I'd be in jail forever. If I did it in Massachusetts, I was fine. But the difference wasn't that it's that there was a stronger movement in Massachusetts, and repressing would have made us even stronger still. And on a small scale, and that was a small scale, I grant you, but on a small scale, that's what it was. There was a moment in Greece, correct me if I've got this wrong. I was there talking to some folks, and it was during the most tumultuous period. They were saying that roughly 40% of the population had gone into the streets. And the people who were talking to me were saying, we got to a point where we had a problem. The only thing left to do was to occupy the government buildings. And there were enough of us, and we literally could have done it. And we were talking about it and thinking about it. And we realized that we had no idea what we would do if we did occupy them. That we just, what the hell would we dare to struggle, dare to win? They weren't going to dare to win in that limited sense because they felt that they had no idea what to do, that they wouldn't have a program, that they wouldn't have any policies. So what that says that we need movements that are self-conscious and that continually become more and more aware of not only how things work, but how things need to work and what needs to be done so that they are in position to take over workplaces and not have them, revert to what they were before, and even take over sectors of government and not have them revert, and so on. So, I can't draw a map, obviously, but I
And
do
no
think,
one's asking you.
huh?
No one is asking you to do that.
Okay.
You mentioned Greece and taking over ministries, as you probably know, in 2015, as a result of a general election. Some of us were actually found ourselves occupying the ministries. I was in the Ministry of Finance for 6 months as the finance minister, and it felt like I was occupying it because the whole 14,000 strong finance minister seemed to be working against the minister, me.
Right.
But it wasn't that we didn't have a program. We had a program in our case. The reason why our revolution was overthrown, why the people were overthrown, was because of what happened within our own government.
Yeah.
The greatest threat to a revolution, to a rebellion, comes from within. The dark side, the blackness, which goes together with the redness of the revolution. That's why the anarchists had the black and red on their flags. Michael Albert, our audience, if they want to read your stuff, where do they go?
Well, ZNet is an obvious destination. I do a podcast titled Revolution Z, which has a lot of stuff like this. But right now, there's also a school, SSCC, School for Social and Cultural Change, .teachable.com. And so that offers courses, and I offer a couple. So that's a possibility. All these things it's not hard. If you look up participatory economics on Google, or you look up me on Google, there's a million things.
And mention your book, the book that's coming out.
Oh, there's a book coming out that's called No Bosses, A New Economy for a Better World. I don't think it'll be out until probably September. I'm waiting for copy editing to be returned. I do think it's the best I've done at succinctly and I hope compellingly making a case, which obviously goes a lot beyond what we could do in an hour, for this new approach to economics.
Well, Michael Albert, thank you so much. On behalf of everyone in the Democracy in Europe movement, DiEM25, across Europe, we even have members in North America. We want to thank you for tonight.
I want to thank you for having me.
Keep going.
I'm the one who gives thank in this case. So thank you very much for having me, Dennis. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Michael.